I just wanted to have a coffee before the meeting. Nothing more. A moment of pause between commitments that seemed to swallow my entire life. I had my cell phone in my hand, reviewing the meeting agenda, when life, ironic and cruel, decided to teach me that some pains are so sharp that not even time can erase them. My eyes, wandering distractedly, found a scene that would make anyone freeze in place. There, at the next table, were my wife and another man. There was no doubt in the way she smiled, in the disguised sparkle in her eyes, in the quick and intimate touch of her hands that tried to appear innocent to anyone who didn't want to see beyond appearances. My stomach turned and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. The world seemed to spin, the air became dense, the noise of the café, the sounds of dishes, voices and machines, everything was muffled in my ears. There was only that image, engraved like a hot iron scar on my soul. I swallowed the shame, the anger, the pain, like someone swallowing broken glass. I got up without thinking much, my steps were automatic, driven by a strength I didn't even know I possessed. I sat at their table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She opened her eyes wide for a second that seemed like an eternity, but recovered her posture in the blink of an eye, as if she wanted to minimize the seriousness of what was happening. The lover, uncomfortable, pretended to search for some explanation at the bottom of his coffee cup, unable to hold his gaze. Without giving space for excuses or lies, I spoke in such a clear and cutting way that even the silence in the room seemed to bend. I'm glad I found you here, take advantage and go to his house, because you won't come into my house anymore. I want a divorce now. Her hand shook slightly. Small detail. But for someone who knows a body as well as I knew hers, that gesture said more than 1,000 words. The lover, that courageless rat, looked away, shrinking into the chair as if he could disappear. And there, in that freezing instant, something inside me died. It wasn't just love, it was something bigger, it was the blind trust in the life I thought I was going to lead, it was the idea that we had built something true, it was the certainty that I knew who slept next to me every night. At that moment, I knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. I left the café without looking back. I left them the bitter taste of shame and took with me a pain that seemed to scream inside my chest. My every step felt like a goodbye to a lifetime. The worst thing about betrayal is not the act itself, but everything it destroys, the moments shared, the plans for the future, the memories that now reek of lies. I found myself reliving scenes, birthdays, trips, lazy Sundays in bed, all corrupted, all stained by that damn afternoon. I wondered how many times this had happened behind my back, how many secret conversations, how many knowing glances and furtive touches had gone unnoticed while I trusted blindly. The next few hours were a blur. I drove aimlessly, my eyes glassy and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to cry, another part wanted to destroy everything, another just wanted to disappear. How can a person you shared your life with become a complete stranger in seconds? I called the lawyer without blinking. The divorce needed to be immediate. No conversation, no second chance. Because whoever cheats once has already cheated 1,000 times inside their head, even before the act takes place. Forgiving would only prolong my own agony. But the story would not end there. The universe, with its silent justice, seemed to have bigger plans for them. It wasn't long before the mask she wore in front of others began to crumble. Little rumors, whispers in corridors, glances crossed at social events. Those who applauded the perfect little couple now whispered behind her back. It wasn't just the shame that hit her. It was something much more cruel, ruin. And with it, despair. I later discovered, from sources I didn't even need to look for, that the lover, so flirtatious and charming, was also a reckless gambler. Not from casinos, but from interests. He had used her money in investments that collapsed like sand castles, taking part of the savings she was trying to save from the divorce. And she, so confident in his cunning, had signed documents without reading them, had bet everything on empty promises, until she found herself on the verge of bankruptcy, isolated, despised even by those who had previously flattered her. Irony of ironies, the man she threw away her entire life for was now dragging her to the bottom of the well. Meanwhile, I was reborn. Not without pain. Not without sleepless nights and hidden tears. But life has strange ways of rewarding those who choose dignity. Amidst the chaos, I met someone. A woman with a sincere smile and firm gaze. Someone who didn't need masks or lies to make himself loved. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could trust again, that I could build something real, without the constant weight of doubt. Still, sometimes the memory of that afternoon comes back like a punch in the gut. Not because of lost love, but because of the silent betrayal that hides in small gestures. A touch of the hand, a guarded smile, a furtive glance. Signs that I would now know how to recognize from afar. Pain taught. The pain transformed. And, in the end, the pain released. But what really happened to her after I lost sight of her that afternoon? How did life take its toll in ways even more cruel and unexpected than she could have ever imagined? How did fate make a point of showing that every choice has a price, and that sometimes that price is too high to pay? Only those who listen to the end will understand how the betrayal that seemed to destroy a man ended up destroying the traitor herself in a way that not even the best planned revenge could have been so perfect. Welcome to the channel, where we believe no betrayal is justifiable. Here, all the stories are fictitious, but they carry a profound truth: betrayal destroys lives, dreams and families. Our goal is to show, through each narrative, the devastating consequences of wrong choices. Get ready, because now you're going to hear an intense story, full of twists and turns, raw emotions, and an ending that will leave you speechless. Take a deep breath, because the story to come is simply shocking. Daniel was the kind of man that many silently admired and few dared to envy openly. Intelligent, dedicated, with a solid career in business management, he had built his path through sacrifices that few have truly witnessed. His days were full of meetings, strategies, numbers that reflected what was necessary to keep the medium-sized empire that he helped to consolidate since he was young. Even with the daily pressure of decisions that affected dozens of people, Daniel maintained kindness in his eyes, politeness in his dealings and an almost unconditional loyalty to those he insisted on keeping close. Among them, the woman he chose to share his life with, Laura. Laura, with her discreet charm and beauty that seemed to require no effort, enchanted her from the first meeting. There was something about her serene smile, her elegant gestures, that made it difficult not to pay attention to her. Graduated in interior design, she carried an aura of sophistication without arrogance. She knew how to move between the most varied environments naturally, always drawing praise for her ability to make any space more welcoming, more beautiful, more alive. It was this balance between strength and sweetness that captured Daniel from their first meetings, where banal conversations turned into deep debates about dreams, the future, and the life they both wanted to build together. Daniel and Laura's relationship blossomed as if it was designed for success. They matched each other in so many ways that, to anyone looking in from the outside, they seemed to have come out of some carefully crafted script. In the early years, his every achievement was celebrated with genuine enthusiasm for her, who in turn was encouraged and admired for her own merits and projects. They shared a large house, decorated with undeniable good taste, located in a neighborhood where the sound of the city became just a distant murmur, a refuge where they could just be themselves, without masks, without external pressures. In the eyes of their friends and family, they were a living example that love and success could go together, even in such fast-paced times. Over time, however, came subtle changes, almost imperceptible at first glance, like tiny cracks in a solid wall that only the attentive eye could perceive. Daniel delved deeper and deeper into his career, pressed by new responsibilities, new challenges that required more than just physical presence, they required mental and emotional concentration. Business trips became more frequent, meetings went beyond schedules, and, although whenever possible he tried to compensate, some important dates ended up getting lost in the rush. Birthdays celebrated in a hurry, dinners postponed due to unpostponable commitments, conversations interrupted by urgent calls. Laura, in turn, seemed to understand, always welcoming, always smiling, but something inside her, that even she herself didn't quite understand, began to change too. What was once pride in his career gradually turned into a strange feeling of distance, as if, even though they lived under the same roof, they inhabited different worlds. In the midst of her own projects and demanding clients, Laura began to question her position in the life they built together. Not that he lacked love, she told herself, but perhaps he lacked the attention, the sparkle in his eyes that Daniel devoted so passionately to his contracts, to his goals. These thoughts grew silently in the early mornings when she woke up alone in the cold bed, waiting to hear the sound of the key in the door and finding only silence. It was during one of these periods of silent solitude that she met Victor. An important client, with engaging speech and easy praise, whose presence seemed to fill the gaps that Laura was reluctant to admit existed. Victor had that kind of charisma that attracted people effortlessly, a mix of confidence and vulnerability that awakened the instinct to feel needed, desired. Professional meetings became frequent meetings, where the limits of formality began to become increasingly blurred. A compliment beyond what was expected, a touch of the hand that took a second longer than acceptable, looks that carried more than the words spoken. Despite this, Laura clung to the idea that it was all just a friendship. They were just fleeting moments of lightness amidst the heavy routine. Nothing that could shake the solid structure that he had built alongside Daniel. At least that was what she insisted on repeating to herself. Victor, on the other hand, seemed to have different plans. He saw more in Laura than a competent professional. He saw a woman in need of attention, thirsty for recognition, and he knew how to explore that need with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to sink their claws. Meanwhile, Daniel remained oblivious to these small storms forming around him. His love for Laura remained intact, even though the way he showed it was, involuntarily, changing. For him, working hard, ensuring stability and building a comfortable future were the greatest proofs of love he could offer. He dreamed of future trips they could take together, of peaceful nights after retirement, with her smile lighting up the house while he would finally have time for her like he always wanted. I didn't see that, for Laura, the present was slipping away like sand between her fingers as she waited for this future that seemed increasingly distant. In moments of pause, Daniel looked at Laura and felt filled with a tenderness that made him forget the worries of the day. I observed her small gestures, the way she arranged the books on the shelf, the way she wrinkled her nose concentrated on a new project, the way she laughed at something she read in silence. Everything in him still vibrated for her. But what I didn't know was that, sometimes, love isn't enough when silent absence occupies spaces that affection no longer fills. And Laura, even without wanting to, let the emptiness grow inside her, fueled by the attention she now found in other eyes, in other words. Victor became a constant presence, a discreet shadow that infiltrated the spaces left by Daniel. But it was still a shadow. Something she insisted on keeping under control, something she swore to herself she would never cross the line. For Laura, each new encounter with Victor was a dangerous dance between the desire to feel alive and the fear of losing everything she had. A tenuous balance between two lives that were beginning to diverge dangerously apart. Daniel, in turn, began to notice small signs. A different perfume, absent smiles, evasive answers. Nothing concrete, nothing I could pinpoint with certainty. Just an uncomfortable feeling, like a wound he couldn't see but was bleeding somewhere inside him. He chose to ignore it, to attribute it to the stress of work, to the natural tensions of a life together. Love, he thought, was strong enough to weather the storms. I just needed time. I just needed patience. The following weeks brought even more subtle changes. Laura seemed more distant at home, more involved with her projects, more absorbed in her own world. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to get closer, arranged dinners, proposed short trips, small gestures to rekindle the flame that he felt was starting to cool. Each attempt was met with kind but empty smiles. As if she were just there with her body present. It was a suffocating feeling, like talking to a ghost. Still, he persisted. I believe that every marriage went through difficult phases and that true love survived everything. The memory of good times was their fuel, the hope of recovering what they had was their motivation. No matter how tired or frustrated he was, Daniel always found the strength to try one more time. Because for him, Laura was still the woman he had chosen to love above all else. What Daniel didn't know, what his heart refused to accept, was that sometimes what seems like just a phase is actually the beginning of the end. And that love, no matter how strong it is, cannot survive alone when trust begins to silently erode from within. And it was like this, between desperate attempts to save what he didn't even know was already beginning to be lost, between promises of a better future and the harsh reality of an empty present, that destiny silently prepared the cruelest blow of his life. That morning seemed more ordinary than it should have been. The sun filtered its soft light through the cracks in the window, drawing shadows on the wooden floor while Daniel straightened his tie in front of the mirror, not realizing that his life was about to shatter in a way that not even the darkest of his thoughts could dare predict. Laura, sitting at the kitchen table, absently leafed through a design magazine, taking sips of a coffee that had long gone cold. They exchanged few words, warm conversations that barely warmed the atmosphere. Daniel believed that everything was just the result of accumulated tiredness, the weight of routine. A dinner planned for that weekend, perhaps a quick getaway somewhere away from the emails and calls, he thought, could rekindle what he felt increasingly distant but still so intensely within himself. The invitation to the coffee meeting came at the last minute, an informal meeting to discuss strategies with a possible new business partner. It was early, the place wouldn't be crowded, it would be quick, practical. He left a loving note on the table before leaving, a simple gesture but full of intention, hoping to make Laura smile when she met him. Dressed in his best navy blue suit, Daniel felt ready to face another day, without suspecting that he was heading towards an abyss. On the way to the café, my head was spinning around expansion ideas, new contracts, new beginnings. Not for a second did he imagine that this would be the day when everything he knew as true would fall apart. The café, with its minimalist and elegant decor, was quiet. Daniel spotted his contact in the background, raised his hand in greeting, but before taking another step, his eyes captured a scene that would freeze his blood. There, a few meters away, sitting at a secluded table, was Laura. And I wasn't alone. The man in front of her seemed to say something that made her smile in a way Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. The kind of smile you give when you are comfortable, intimate, complicit. Every gesture between them, every look, every slight inclination of their bodies towards each other was a silent language that didn't need translation. The impact was so brutal that, for a moment, Daniel felt his legs weaken. Like someone watching a movie in slow motion, he watched as Laura lightly touched the other man's hand, enough to break down all the defenses he was still trying to maintain within himself. The coffee in the cup trembled between her fingers, and yet her laughter sounded light, relaxed. The other man, confident, reciprocated each gesture with an irritating naturalness, as if nothing in the world could break the bubble in which they found themselves. Every second seemed to drag on for an eternity. Daniel felt a whirlwind of emotions mix inside him, disbelief, anger, pain, shame. There was no doubt. It wasn't a business meeting. It wasn't a casual lunch. It was something that carried the intimacy of someone who had already crossed lines that should remain sacred. He took a deep breath, trying to gather the pieces of his dignity scattered across the invisible floor, as thoughts raced through his mind. He could have left, ignored, pretended not to see, preserved the illusion that was now disintegrating before his eyes. But some force within him, primal and irreducible, pushed him forward. With firm steps, he approached the table. Laura's gaze, upon seeing him, went from laughter to paralysis in a fraction of a second. His lips parted, as if searching for words that simply didn't exist. The lover, taken by surprise, straightened up in the chair, discomfort showing in every gesture. Daniel pulled up a chair and sat between the two as if that were the most natural thing to do. He looked at Laura with a serenity that masked the hurricane within him and, without raising his voice, he uttered words that cut the air like blades. "I'm glad I found you here, take advantage and go to his house, because you won't come into my house anymore. I want a divorce now." The silence that followed seemed to echo throughout the corners of the café, as if even time had held its breath. Laura tried to mumble something, but no words came out. The lover looked away, embarrassed, small, unable to support the weight of his own presence. Daniel stood up, straightened his jacket and walked outside, each step carrying the weight of a lifetime being left behind. The air outside felt different, heavier, harder to breathe. Daniel sat in his car without starting the engine. He just stood there, staring into space ahead, feeling the world spinning erratically. Scenes from his life with Laura invaded his mind like mocking ghosts. The trips they planned, the intimate dinners, the promises whispered in the dark. Everything now seemed like a lie. Every gesture, every word, every affection, everything was contaminated by that new reality. On the way home, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He thought of thousands of scenarios, millions of unanswered questions. When did it start? How did you not see it? Where were you when everything started to fall apart? But deep down, a part of him knew there was no point in seeking explanations. Some things just happen without warning, without justice, without sense. And all the love in the world is not enough to stop reality from crushing the hearts of those who believed too much. At home, every object seemed to mock him. The carefully thought-out decoration, the framed photographs on the walls, the small details that have been built over the years. Daniel walked through the rooms like a stranger in his own story. In every corner, in every smell, a memory struck him. But now, all those memories felt dirty, stained by betrayal. And yet, part of him insisted on missing him, as if it were possible to separate the Laura he loved from the Laura he now knew. The following hours were a mix of action and apathy. He looked for lawyers, friends, advice, all in search of some guidance to cross the minefield that his life had become. The word divorce echoed in his mind like a relentless hammer, and with it came all the losses he knew he would have to face. Not just the woman he loved, but the life he had dreamed of with her, the plans, the possible futures that would never exist now. Laura tried to contact. Missed calls, messages deleted without being read. Daniel knew that hearing her voice at that moment would be giving in to a weakness he couldn't allow himself. Every second away from her was like forcibly ripping off a piece of himself, but it was necessary. The wounded dignity cried out for distance, for silence, for oblivion. Deep down, I knew this pain would be a slow and painful process, a wound that would bleed for much longer than I cared to admit. However, there was something more. Something Daniel didn't yet know. Something hiding behind the betrayal, like an even darker shadow about to be revealed. Something that would make the pain I felt now seem almost bearable in light of what was yet to come. And when the truth finally came out, it would not only destroy what little was left of Laura's image, but it would also forever transform the way Daniel would see himself, the world, and those he dared to trust. Daniel woke up early that morning, his body still heavy from the last few days, but his mind sharp as ever. Since the discovery in the café, something inside him had changed forever. There was no longer room for doubts, blame or regrets. It was as if a switch had been flipped, illuminating a dark part of his soul that he had always preferred to keep dormant. But now, awake, he was unable to turn back. He had spent the last night planning his steps with calculated coldness, guided not by irrational anger, but by the absolute need for justice, for reparation. I would not allow him to be treated like an unresponsive fool. I wouldn't allow the two of them to escape the destruction they caused and scathed. He dressed calmly, each button fastened with the determination of someone going to war. In the mirror, he faced his own reflection, no longer seeing the man he had dreamed of a peaceful life, but someone forged by pain, hardened by betrayal. He left the house without making a sound, walking to the office of the lawyer he had hired as soon as the storm began. Everything was already ready. All that remained was to sign the last authorizations. Inside the austere room, with books lined up on the shelves and the smell of old leather, Daniel listened attentively to the lawyer's instructions. Joint accounts would be frozen immediately, credit cards cancelled, real estate assets judicially frozen until the divorce was finalized. No transaction would be possible without your prior authorization. The lawyers assured that they were acting within the law, protecting their rights in the face of the breach of marital trust. Daniel signed each document with almost surgical precision, feeling, with each initial, that he was recovering pieces of the dignity that had been ripped away from him. With everything finished, he left the building with a bitter feeling of victory. The battle was not for revenge, it was for the restoration of himself. And I knew that this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Laura moved as if nothing had changed. I naively believed that filing for divorce would just be a painful but brief process. A civilized division of assets, friendly agreements, perhaps even a reconstruction of life alongside Victor, who now occupied more and more space in his days. I had no idea of the approaching storm. That same afternoon, Laura tried to use her card to buy some trivial items. Refused. Tried again, at another store. Nothing. The first spark of despair lit inside her. He called the bank, and the information was clear and direct: access was blocked by court order. He tried to contact his trusted manager, but the answer came even more cutting: any movement would depend on Daniel's express authorization. Confused, with her heart racing, she ran home, where Victor was already waiting for her. His hands, which had held her firmly so many times, now trembled upon receiving the news. Laura tried to explain in disjointed words; she felt her throat close with each new sentence said. Victor, in turn, didn't try to hide his panic. I knew what that meant. The stability he had promised her, the golden future he had sold with sweet words, evaporated before her incredulous eyes. It was in this state of desperation that they decided to confront Daniel. They couldn't allow it to end like this, without explanations, without possibilities. They arranged a meeting, under the pretext of discussing terms of separation. Daniel, for reasons that even he couldn't quite explain, accepted. He wanted to see with his own eyes the damage that was beginning to form. The meeting took place in a neutral office, away from known eyes. Laura arrived first, her eyes red, her face begging for mercy. Victor followed close behind, trying to appear confident, but the tension bounced in his rigid muscles. Daniel entered last, his posture impeccable, his expression impenetrable. Laura was the first to speak, her voice choked, trying to find some humanity in the cold figure that now occupied the space of who had once been her husband. I tried to appeal to memories, to old feelings, as if there was still something there that could be rescued. Victor tried to remain in the background, but anxiety made him intervene at inopportune moments, only to be silenced by Daniel's sharp gaze. The tension in the air was palpable, almost material. With each of Laura's words, Daniel remained calm, listening without interrupting. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Then, he slowly stood up, approached the table and placed both hands on it, leaning slightly forward, as if preparing the final blow. In a controlled tone, but filled with devastating strength, Daniel revealed what he had done. He told how, from the moment he left the café that damned morning, he hadn't wasted a single second in protecting what was rightfully his. He detailed, without haste, the blocking of accounts, the suspension of cards, the impossibility of any financial transactions without his authorization. He explained how all joint assets were now under judicial protection, unattainable for either of them until the divorce was finalized on his terms. Laura's eyes widened, unable to hide her shock. She tried to protest, to say that it was inhumane, that she also had rights, that she couldn't simply be left with nothing. Victor, trying to control himself, got up and tried to argue, saying that she was entitled to half, that this was abuse. Daniel just smiled, a cold, distant smile, and replied with a tone of voice that would make any hope vanish into thin air: half of her is safe, awaiting the judge's decision. Until then, any attempted withdrawal or sale would be considered illegal. And if they tried something, he wouldn't hesitate to take even harsher measures. Reality fell on Laura like an unbearable weight. The entire sandcastle she believed she had built with Victor crumbled before her. Victor, realizing there was nothing to be done, began to emotionally withdraw right then and there, as if the woman he had promised to support was now nothing more than a potential problem. His expression changed, it became cold, practical. The kind of change Laura never thought she would see in that face that smiled at her so many times. Feeling the ground slipping away from her feet, Laura tried one last trick. He approached Daniel, his eyes teary, his voice trembling, saying that despite everything, there was still feeling, there was still love, that they could, perhaps, find a less cruel solution to all of that. Daniel watched her in silence for a few seconds that seemed like eternities. In another time, perhaps your heart would have wavered. Perhaps he had found room for mercy. But now, there was no more room for anything but the truth. And the truth was that the woman before him was no longer the Laura he loved. She was just a stranger. Without saying anything else, he turned and left, leaving behind two devastated faces, two souls trapped in a hell created by their own choices. The sound of their footsteps echoing down the hallway was the last thing they heard before the full weight of reality crushed them. And what Laura and Victor still didn't know was that the worst was just beginning. Laura's phone remained silent for hours after the office meeting. She desperately tried to find in Victor a sign of support, a promise of resistance, any spark of hope that could mitigate the avalanche that swallowed her. However, Victor was no longer the same. Distant, cold, he now seemed like a stranger sitting next to her, looking out the window as if he were trapped in a choice that he never really wanted to make. The atmosphere between the two was heavy, suffocating, full of unspoken words and resentments that grew like weeds in dry soil. They tried to discuss solutions, strategies, but what used to be a partnership was now reduced to exchanges of veiled accusations and a silence that hurt more than any scream. When night fell, Laura, overcome by an anguish she didn't know how to contain, decided to look for Daniel once again. Not to ask for money, not to renegotiate terms, but to try, in some desperate way, to rescue lost dignity. She knew she would be received with contempt, perhaps with indifference, but she couldn't bear the idea of just being a mistake in his life. He got in the car and drove to the building where Daniel was known to be temporarily staying. With each kilometer covered, I felt my heart tighten in knots that were impossible to undo, my mind reliving, like an endless punishment, each moment in which it exchanged the certain for the uncertain. On the other side, Daniel was finishing packing some things into boxes. He didn't want to keep anything that reminded him of Laura other than the inevitable divorce process. The doorbell rang shrill in the silent night, breaking him out of his thoughts. When he opened the door, he found Laura standing there, vulnerable as he had never seen her before. For a brief moment, the two just stared at each other, an abyss of hurt and resentment separating them. Laura asked to come in with a choked voice, and Daniel, against every instinct that told him to shut her out of his life forever, gave in. Inside the small rented apartment, the smell of change was strong, boxes piled up, clothes still folded, everything indicating that there was no home there, just a way station. They sat on opposite sides of the room, like two strangers forced to share the same space, united only by the past that now weighed them down like chains. Laura was the first to speak. With words that seemed to hurt in his throat, he confessed that he had lost himself in an illusion, that he had confused absence with abandonment, that he had sought the attention from someone else that he thought he could no longer find at home. Daniel listened to everything in silence, without interrupting, without allowing the pain to show on his face. When Laura, with tears flowing freely, said that she still loved him, that she wanted to try to start over, he just tilted his head to the side, as if observing a tragedy that had already been announced. In response, Daniel spoke calmly, but each word weighed like lead. He said that love without respect built nothing, that betrayal was not just physical, but a denial of everything they once promised each other. He said he could no longer look at her and see the woman he loved, that any attempt to rescue what they had would be like trying to rebuild a bridge that had already been burned to the ground. Laura, feeling the blow of each sentence, tried to hold back her sobs, but failed miserably. Victor called in the middle of the conversation, and Laura, embarrassed, hung up the phone without answering. Daniel couldn't help but smile bitterly when he saw the name on the screen. For him, this was just more proof that Laura's priorities had changed long before that conversation. She tried to convince him that they were still possible, but reality imposed itself in a cruel way. There was a new life waiting for her, a life she had chosen and now tried to escape when the winds changed direction. After hours of conversation, where everything that needed to be said was finally exposed, Daniel asked her to leave. There was nothing left there that could be saved. Laura left without saying a word, dragging with her the weight of a choice that she now recognized as irreversible. In the hallway, he stopped for a moment, trying to catch his breath, as if the air itself refused to fill his lungs. I knew that this was the end of everything they had built. Meanwhile, Victor, no longer patient, was putting pressure on Laura to resolve the situation in some way that would be favorable to them. The conversations between them began to take on harsher tones, veiled discussions about money, about promises made in moments of passion that now proved impossible to keep. Laura found herself trapped, slowly realizing that Victor was not the safe haven she imagined. It was, in fact, just a shelter of convenience, as unstable as the ground that now crumbled beneath his feet. In a last desperate effort, Laura tried to negotiate with Daniel through lawyers, suggesting agreements that would preserve part of his standard of living. But the answer was harsh and unchanging. Nothing would be decided outside of judicial procedures, nothing would be given out of pity or compassion. Everything would be resolved within the law, exactly as it should be. It was as if Daniel had erased any trace of the understanding and loving man he once was, leaving only a hardened, fair and merciless version. Victor, seeing the situation getting worse, began to distance himself from Laura. Promises of eternal love evaporated in the face of the stark reality of lack of resources. Romantic outings became rare, gifts disappeared, plans for the future were replaced by discussions about bills, debts and obligations. Victor, who before was all smiles and vows, was now just silence and veiled demands. Laura, in a mix of shame and sadness, realized that she was alone, more alone than she had ever been with Daniel. When the judicial process finally advanced and the first decisions began to be made, reality became inescapable. Laura lost her immediate right to the assets she believed were rightfully hers. Access to the money that supported his comfortable life was cut off, credit cards cancelled, the possibility of starting over financially with Victor reduced to dust. They had to hurriedly leave the rented apartment where they tried, in vain, to build a new life. Victor was the first to leave, without even looking back, leaving Laura plunged into a despair that seemed to have no end. Daniel, in turn, took no pleasure in watching her downfall. There was pain, yes, a cold, dull pain that accompanied him with every step, but there was no revenge in his heart, only the need to move away, to preserve what was left of his soul. He focused on work, on the few true friends he had left, on the silent reconstruction of a life that would now have to be entirely his own. On a cold, gray afternoon, sitting in a new office, reviewing documents, Daniel received an unexpected visit from Sophia, an old acquaintance that time had kept distant, but who now appeared like a fresh breeze in the middle of the winter of his life. Sophia was everything that Laura once was and more, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, who carried the promise of sincerity in her eyes and in her voice a song that Daniel had forgotten how it sounded. There was no rush, there was no despair. Just two tired souls who recognized each other in pain and found, in each other, a real chance for a fresh start. While Daniel took small steps towards a new life, Laura was lost in unfamiliar streets, looking for something she could no longer reach. And Victor, gone like a shadow carried away by the wind, was just a bitter reminder of the price she would forever pay for choices made without considering the consequences. The cycle had closed, but the scars would remain, telling, in silence, the story of a betrayed love, of shattered dreams and the painful, but necessary, reconstruction of a life from the ruins. The days dragged like cold shadows around Laura, each one heavier than the last. She wandered the streets aimlessly, carrying with her an emptiness that seemed bottomless. There were no more plans to save, no more promises to keep, not even a place to call home. After Victor disappeared, reality hit her with a force that not even her worst nightmares predicted. She tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, but it was impossible to ignore the shame that gnawed at her soul every time she had to explain to herself how she had lost everything for a passion as brief as it was destructive. Her friends, those who used to smile at lunches and social gatherings, now avoided her, as if failure were contagious. Her parents, still perplexed by the direction her life had taken, offered discreet support, but there was a mixture of sadness and disapproval in their eyes that made her want to disappear from the world. Meanwhile, Daniel was rebuilding himself with a painful serenity, like someone picking up his own pieces without complaining. His focus was now on rebuilding himself not as the man he once was, but as someone who knew the harshness of the world in an intimate way. Even though he tried to live his life in a pragmatic way, the marks that the betrayal had left on his chest insisted on throbbing in moments of solitude. Conversations with Sophia began to gain space in her routine almost imperceptibly. No expectations, no big declarations. Just two presences who, little by little, found comfort in each other's company. Sophia, with her patience and her honest way of looking at Daniel, did something he barely knew he needed. She taught him to allow himself to be vulnerable again. But even with this new perspective looming on the horizon, Daniel had a dilemma that consumed him on nights when silence weighed too much. A part of him wanted to believe that all the suffering had been necessary for him to find something true, but another part, more bitter and more human, questioned whether it was fair to start over without looking back. I knew that Laura was sunk in debt, without support, carrying the consequences of her choices like invisible crosses. I also knew that if I reached out, even out of pure compassion, I could help her get back on her feet in some way. But wounded pride, the vivid memory of abandonment and betrayal, weighed more than any impulse of generosity. These thoughts tormented him when, one cloudy afternoon, he received a handwritten letter. Laura, in shaky and disordered words, asked for just one thing, to be allowed to sell her share of a small property that they had bought together years ago, even before their wedding. It was a worthless property, forgotten among the divorce papers, but which could now represent for her a minimal chance of regaining control of her own life. Laura didn't ask for forgiveness, or love, or reconciliation. Just a cold, objective gesture, a last chance to not drown completely. Daniel spent hours with the letter in his hands, weighing each possibility. Refusing would mean watching, from a distance, the complete downfall of someone who, despite everything, was once your everything. Accepting would be like betraying one's own pain, like allowing their story to have any outcome other than oblivion. The decision seemed simple, but what made it difficult was the deep humanity Daniel still carried, the inability to completely ignore their shared history, even if that history had ended in the worst possible way. That night, he went for an aimless walk, as he did when he needed to organize his thoughts. The city lights flickered in the distance, reflecting on the windows of the buildings like memories that insisted on remaining. Each step echoed on the wet sidewalks, each breath seemed heavier than the last. I thought of Laura, lost, proud and broken at the same time. He thought of Sophia, luminous, serene, offering him a new chance that he didn't want to tarnish with old ghosts. He thought about himself, the man he had been, the man he was, the man he wanted to be. He arrived home late, exhausted but determined. He sat at the table and wrote a brief answer. I would authorize the sale of the property, but not out of pity. He would do this because it was what he needed to do to close the chapter once and for all, to clear his own conscience of any shadow of resentment. He wouldn't be complicit in Laura's destruction, but he also wouldn't be her savior again. She would at least have a chance to start over. The rest would be her responsibility. When he sent the letter the next day, he felt a strange lightness, as if something had finally been resolved within him. There was no explicit forgiveness, no reconciliation possible. There was just the recognition that sometimes moving forward takes more courage than any kind of revenge. Laura received the news with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. She knew that Daniel had the right to refuse, she knew that, by accepting, he demonstrated a greatness that she no longer deserved to witness. He sold the property discreetly, used the money to rent a small apartment on the outskirts and tried, for the first time in a long time, to live a life without subterfuge, without emotional crutches. Meanwhile, the relationship between Daniel and Sophia matured as naturally as the seasons change. There was no rush, there were no demands. There were only two hearts that were cautious, but willing to try again. The meetings became more frequent, the silences more comfortable. Sophia understood the scars that Daniel carried and didn't try to erase them, she just offered a safe space for him to exist, without masks, without unrealistic expectations. In one of these meetings, sitting on a park bench, Daniel opened his heart in a raw way. He told Sophia not only about the betrayal, but about the dilemma he faced when deciding whether or not to help the woman who hurt him so much. Sophia, with her silent wisdom, just held his hand and said that forgiving was not forgetting, nor getting back together, but choosing not to carry the weight of hatred for the rest of your life. Daniel, upon hearing those simple words, felt a peace he had not known for a long time. The falling action of this story was not marked by grand gestures or explosive revelations. It was built in the painful slowness of those who need to relearn how to trust, how to love, how to dream. Daniel understood that some pain never completely goes away, but he also learned that it doesn't have to define who he was. And Laura, in her small apartment, looking at the city through the window, realized, too late, that betrayals don't just kill relationships. They kill entire versions of ourselves, versions that can never be recovered. All that remained was the outcome, that final moment in which all destinies would intertwine to show that, even from the greatest ruins, something new can blossom. Something unexpected, perhaps, but profoundly true. Time, that silent sculptor of destinies, continued its relentless work, shaping the new lives that emerged from the ashes of what was once an entire day. Daniel got used to walking among interior ruins, not as someone seeking to rebuild what he lost, but as someone learning to recognize the bitter beauty of survival. In every daily gesture, there was a growing acceptance that certain pains do not require healing, just respect. Next to Sophia, the days became less harsh, lighter, as if life, in its infinite irony, granted a second chance to those who had the courage to go through the storm without becoming bitter. Laura, on the other hand, was on a dangerous threshold between regret and resignation. He tried to reorganize his existence in whatever way possible, working on small decoration projects for acquaintances, accumulating hours and days in modest apartments, far from the refined environments he had once naturally frequented. Each mirror he passed gave him an image that seemed to ask him where the confident and desired woman who once thought she was invincible had gone. He knew he couldn't blame betrayal alone for his downfall. The truth was crueler, it was her own inability to value what she had that had thrown her into the void in which she now struggled. One afternoon, at the end of a business meeting, Daniel found Sophia waiting for him in the building's lobby, smiling in a way that warmed him more than the autumn sun outside. Without much of a plan, they decided to stroll around the city, walking leisurely through the streets, stopping to watch street musicians, children playing, old people sitting on benches discussing banal things. Sophia spoke little. She knew that Daniel was still processing pieces of a story that, although left behind, left invisible traces. In a moment of silence, she stopped in front of a small old bookstore and suggested they go inside. Inside, the smell of aged paper and polished wood brought an unexpected sense of peace. Sophia pulled a book off the shelf, opened it to a random page and read out loud, "Don't carry stones in your chest that don't belong to you." Daniel smiled in a way he hadn't smiled in years. It was there, among dusty books and forgotten words, that he realized that love, when true, didn't need to be urgent or dramatic. It was enough to exist. Meanwhile, Laura was fighting another silent battle. Every attempt to rebuild social ties was met with a wall of distrust or indifference. The circles that once welcomed her now saw her as an inconvenient ghost, a living reminder that no status is immune to ruin. The nights were long, filled with deafening silences and unwanted memories. Sometimes she would wake up sweaty in the middle of the night, with the clear feeling of having heard Daniel's voice calling her, only to realize that it was just her mind playing cruel tricks. His absence was a gaping hole in her chest, a reminder of everything that could never be recovered. The inevitable reunion took place on a rainy afternoon, at a convention center where, by bitter coincidence, both were invited to different events. Daniel, accompanied by Sophia, was walking distractedly through the main lobby when his eyes met Laura's. For a moment, time seemed to suspend its march. She was thinner, her face marked by sleepless nights, her hair tied up in any way, wearing simple clothes that clashed with her surroundings. He was serene, with Sophia at his side radiating that calm lightness. There were no words exchanged, just looks that said everything that needed to be said. Laura looked down, unable to bear the weight of guilt and shame. Daniel, in turn, kept his gaze steady for a few moments before moving on, without anger, without hurt, just with the certainty that they now belonged to different universes. In the car, Sophia broke the silence, asking gently if everything was okay. Daniel honestly answered yes, and that, for the first time in a long time, he felt free from the past. Sophia didn't insist. Did you know that certain pains heal better when they are not turned over? That night, they toasted in a small, cozy restaurant, celebrating not only what they were building, but also everything they were able to leave behind. Across town, Laura sat on her narrow bed, looking out the raindrop-fogged window. He wondered, with excruciating pain, at what exact moment he had stopped deserving the love that Daniel had given him so unconditionally. I knew I would never find someone like him, not because I would idealize him, but because men like Daniel, whole even after their hearts were broken, were rare as diamonds and as difficult to find as they were to keep. The moral dilemma that hung over Daniel still resonated in some moments of introspection. He knew that forgiving was an act for himself, not for others, and that he should not carry resentment as a legacy of pain. But he also knew that forgiving did not mean forgetting, much less allowing those who destroyed us to once again have any power over our peace. Daniel chose the difficult road, not to become what hurt him, to not reproduce in others the poison he once tasted. And that choice, although painful, was what allowed him to truly smile again. In the midst of this quiet rebirth, Sophia became more than a companion. It became a mirror where Daniel could see himself without deformations, without masks. Her every gesture, every word, every little care, was a reminder that he was still capable of being loved, not despite the scars, but precisely because he had them and survived them. Sophia didn't want the Daniel from before, she wanted the Daniel that life had forged in pain, in overcoming, in reborn hope. A few steps away, Laura began to understand what it meant to live with one's mistakes without the illusion that time would fix everything. The marks he carried were not just external. They were in the way she looked in the mirror, how she hesitated before trusting someone, how she avoided the streets where she might encounter familiar faces who would one day smile at her. I was learning, brutally, that some choices exact prices that are paid forever. Thus, without big explosions, without cinematic endings, the story was heading towards its inevitable outcome. An outcome where each person, in their own way, would find what they deserved. Not as punishment or reward, but as the simple consequence of the seeds they planted, the paths they chose, the truths they accepted or ignored. Time, patient and silent, continued to weave its invisible threads, preparing the final scene where everything that began with betrayal would finally be sealed with the only justice that life allows, the justice of consequence. Spring arrived timidly, bringing a breath of renewal that seemed to ignore the weight of the human stories that continued, silently, to unfold under its days of clear skies and warm breezes. For Daniel, each morning was a silent reassurance that he had survived the worst. The invisible scar he carried was no longer an open wound, but a mark that told a story of rebirth. Life at Sophia's side progressed with the mature serenity of someone who knew what they had lost and, therefore, valued every small gesture of affection, every conversation shared without haste, every comfortable silence. There was no longer any urgency to prove anything to the world, nor to himself. What existed was a discrete peace, a type of happiness that didn't need to be displayed to be real. Sophia had become not just a companion, but a new perspective. Someone who understood the broken pieces of Daniel without trying to patch them up, just accepting them as part of who he was. In her presence, he didn't need to hide his scars, nor fear being fragile. He had finally found what so many seek in vain, a love that didn't require masks, that flourished in imperfections. They decided, without fanfare, to build a new story together, far from the old scenarios, far from the old pains. They moved to a small house surrounded by trees, where the days blended with the sound of the wind in the leaves and the soft scent of wildflowers. There, between simplicity and truth, Daniel found his redemption. Laura, in turn, wandered the gray streets of her new reality. The small decoration projects I had managed were no longer enough to cover basic expenses. The money from the sale of the property had quickly evaporated in the face of life's merciless demands. Every job lost, every door closed was a cruel reminder of the choices made in the name of an ephemeral passion. Loneliness became his only constant companion. The friends of the past dispersed like smoke in the wind, and attempts to rebuild relationships were met with suspicious looks or, even worse, with the cutting indifference of those who no longer saw value in their presence. Over time, Laura found herself forced to accept temporary jobs in stores and cafes, jobs that, years before, she would never have considered. Every forced smile at hurried customers was a small humiliation that he swallowed in silence, knowing that there was no one else to share the weight of his fall. The nights were the worst. Lying on a cold bed, in a soulless room, I relived scenes from the past with cruel precision. I remembered Daniel's look, the safety of his arms, the silent tenderness of his gestures. It was in these moments, when the world seemed to cease, that Laura understood the true dimension of what she had lost, not just a man, but the possibility of a full life with someone who loved her more than she was capable of loving herself. Victor, the man who had been the catalyst for the tragedy, disappeared like the shadow he always was. Rumors said that he had moved to another city, looking for new opportunities, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered illusions. For Laura, all that was left was the bitter realization that she was just one of many to believe sweet lies packaged in empty words. There was no justice to be done, no reparation possible. Each one bore the weight of their own choices, and hers had been, from the beginning, to walk towards her own ruin believing that she would find freedom. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench, Laura saw children playing, running carefree under the sun. He smiled, but soon the smile disappeared, swallowed by the sadness that had lodged in his soul. He understood that time would not offer miracles, that there was no automatic redemption for those who destroyed what was most precious to them. The forgiveness he sought so much would not come from others, nor from Daniel, but only from honestly facing his own truth. Betrayal had not only condemned her to the loss of love, but to the brutal need to rebuild herself from scratch, without shortcuts, without illusions. Years later, Daniel and Sophia walked through the same square, now with light steps and serene faces. Sophia talked excitedly about a new project she wanted to start, while Daniel, with a sincere smile, listened to her with genuine attention. As they passed a bench, their eyes, for an instant, met Laura's. It was a brief encounter, a breath of the past that hung in the air for a second before being carried away by the wind. Laura, sitting with a book in her hands, smiled shyly, without getting up, without trying to approach. Daniel returned the smile with a slight, respectful wave, but his steps didn't falter. There was no hatred, no bitterness, just a silent recognition that they had both taken irreversible paths. Laura stood there, watching them walk away, feeling the peace that radiated from them both. There was no envy, just a gentle melancholy for all that could have been and would never be again. In his chest, finally, a painful and liberating acceptance. Sometimes losing is the only way to learn the true value of things. And at that moment, alone in the golden evening light, Laura understood that her life was not over yet. There were still possible paths, even if different from the ones he had dreamed of. She got up slowly, put the book in her bag and walked in the opposite direction, without rushing, carrying with her not the childish hope that time would erase the past, but the silent courage of someone who finally decides to face themselves. Thus, each piece of the story found its place. Daniel, rebuilt not by anger but by the strength of his own dignity. Sophia, a companion who knew how to water the arid terrain of distrust with patience and true love. Laura, a fallen but not defeated woman, learning that the deepest redemption is one that does not require an audience, just the honesty of recognizing one's own mistakes. And Victor, lost in his own shadows, a living reminder that those who destroy without looking back sooner or later also lose themselves along the way. Each followed its course, like rivers that once met and then separated forever. There was no absolute justice, no perfect revenge. There was only the truth of life, hard, real, inescapable. And sometimes, that is the only justice possible. If you've made it this far, you've certainly felt every emotion of this intense story. Now we want to know, what did you think of this ending? Comment below, we want to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how choices shape people's destinies. And always remember, this channel does not, under any circumstances, support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show, through these stories, how a lack of loyalty can destroy lives. Thank you very much for being with us until the end. See you in the next story.